Now we're going to learn about genetics. Signed genetics. Long ago, a man by the name of Gregor Mendel he studied and focused on science. For about the year of around the 1860s was when he was mostly working in the country of Austria. He was a monk. The field of science that he focused on was biology. So, Gregor Mendel noticed that the pea plants that were growing around him had a variety to them, and he was curious. Why did some have things that others didn't? How did that happen? What was going on inside of the plant? So that was his course of study. The word trait. What does that mean exactly? Well, inside animals, plants, any living thing, they have traits. Gregor Mendel studied them and noticed that one plant who had something specific or special about it would have that trait, and it would be passed on through the offspring and the generations. What exactly is a trait? Well, maybe they're tall or maybe they're short. Maybe it's green or it's yellow. Maybe the seed looks like a teardrop or it looks more like a ball. Genetics focuses on using a word called heredity. The sign is heredity. What does that word mean? Well, we all know that we have a mom and a dad. Their traits get passed on to the children. And then they proceed to give it to their children and theirs, and so on and so forth. So because he studied, Gregor Mendel became known as the father of genetics. So how did he decide to study? Why pea plants? Well, they grow very quickly. So that meant that he could study various generations of them as they grew and see the differences. Also, peas aren't just one kind. There is a large variety of them. So he decided to see how reproduction occurred. He realized it was something called pollination. What does that word mean? Well, suppose you have a flower. Inside the flower, it has two different things. One of them is like a female, the other is like a male. Pollen is transferred from the one section to the other. If there's only one flower or one plant involved, it's called self-pollination. But if there's two flowers or two plants involved, that has a different term called cross-pollination. Mendel used different kinds of things to do his experiments. Maybe he picked one that was yellow or one that was green and he combined them together. Or maybe he took a tall plant and a short plant and bred them together to see what would happen. So first, the short plant was paired with another short plant, and the offspring that emerged were both short. So again, those two new plants He again cross-pollinated, and again they were short. So Mendel decided that short is what's called a purebred. It means that that is the only kind, and they will always be short. So then he took a tall plant and a tall plant, cross-pollinated them, and got the offspring. He expected that they would both be tall, but that wasn't what happened. He got one tall and one short. And he didn't understand why did that happen. So next, he took a tall plant and a short plant and cross-pollinated them. The two of them were both tall. Where did the short go? Well, so now he took those two new tall plants, cross-pollinated them. One was tall, the other was short. Why was it short? How did the shortness come back? Oh, so then Mendel started thinking about it, and he came to a realization. Inside of the plants, they have traits. Tall with tall makes a tall plant. Short with short will make a short plant. But let's suppose you cross-pollinate a tall with a short. What are you going to get? A tall plant. The short is still inside the plants, but the tall is what you see. So he started thinking about it, and he realized that the traits stay inside, and they are passed on through the generations, because every trait has a gene. One trait actually has 2 genes. So every single plant has 2 genes. So now he started thinking and observing and testing his thinking, and he came to a realization. If the plant has 2 tall genes, you will get a tall plant. If the plant has 1 short gene and 1 tall gene, you will still get a tall plant. But if it has 2 short genes, that's when you get a short plant. Okay, so the tall characteristics looks like it's more powerful than the short one. So the tall is called a dominant trait, or a dominant gene. The short is called recessive. So how do you show that? Well, you use capital letters for the dominant trait and lowercase letters for the recessive trait. Let's suppose a plant has 2 dominant traits, or maybe 2 recessive traits. It will be considered a purebred plant. The word purebred means that it has both of the same trait. Dominant with dominant, or recessive with recessive. There's a word called hybrid. That means that it has 1 dominant with 1 recessive. So, Gregor Mendel continued his research and his studying, and he came up with a hypothesis that explained everything that he saw. This plant has 2, and so does the other. But when they give their genes to the offspring, they don't give both. They only give 1. And that's how the new plant gets 2. So let's suppose the father and a mother. The father has 2 genes, and the mother has 2 genes. But mom only gives 1, and dad gives 1. So the new baby has 2 genes, 1 from mom and 1 from dad. So altogether, Gregor Mendel, after all of his thinking and observation, was finally able to explain everything. What does that explanation look like? Both parents combine to make 1 offspring, and they have 2 genes. Let's suppose mom gives a recessive and dad gives a dominant. Now the offspring has 1 dominant and 1 recessive. So you will see the dominant trait. But now these 2 new offspring are cross-pollinated and they create 2 more. They still have 1 dominant with 1 dominant, 1 dominant with 1 recessive, another dominant with another recessive, and then 2 recessives. Most of the time, Gregor Mendel's ideas were right, but some things were a little bit different. There was another scientist by the name of Karl Correns. He was from Germany, and he also studied science. And he found that some didn't have a dominant or a recessive trait. They were simply there. So when they combined together, their offspring was actually a mix. For example, suppose you have a white flower and a red flower. When you combine them together, they would create a pink flower because it didn't have a dominant or a recessive trait. So when they combined, they simply mixed together. Plants aren't the only things to do that either. It will happen in animals too. But suppose you want to show all of this in writing. How do you write that down? It's called a Punnett chart, Punnett square. You can actually show all the outcomes of the cross-pollination. And you can show the percentage of what will happen for each option. The one parent is on the top, the other is on the side, and then the boxes fill in with all the different combinations of the genes. Now another man by the name of Thomas Hunt Morgan, right around the year 1907, he studied as well, but his focus was on chromosomes and genetics. He actually found that women have chromosomes that are the same shape. However, men's chromosomes are actually different shapes. One chromosome looks kind of like a rod. It just stands up and down, and that's called the X chromosome. The other one looks more like a hook, and that one is called the Y chromosome. So he continued to study and test, and he found out that the X and the Y are actually different chromosomes. At the same time, he discovered that if a man has an X and a Y, but if they're a woman, they will have 2 X's. So now, X and Y chromosomes are called the sex chromosome. Some vocabulary that's important. P1, that means the first plant or the first parent. F1 means the first offspring or the new plant. The word F is filial. F2 is the second offspring, or the second filial. So parents are the first one, P1. They then create F1, or the first filial, who then creates F2, the second filial. The word heterozygous. What does that word mean? Well, let's break it apart. Hetero means different. So, the meaning of heterozygous is that it has one dominant and one recessive put together. It's very similar to another word called hybrid. Another word is homozygous. And again, when you separate the word, homo means the same. So homozygous means they have two dominant genes if it's homozygous dominant. If it's homozygous recessive, that means that they have two recessive genes. The word genotype means the specific DNA or the specific gene that is inside of something. The word phenotype actually means the trait or the characteristic that you can physically see. Now understand, sometimes two animals will seem the same because they have the same phenotype. However, their genotype is still different.